Please be seated. Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mike Stocks with Seminar Group 6. Slow buffaloes. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Douglas Macgregor to speak with us today on the subject of strategic challenges in warfare. Dr. Macgregor is an outstanding strategist and well-versed on the subject of strategic challenges in warfare, as noted by having authored 4 books related to this field of study. He is also a retired colonel and decorated combat veteran, having been commissioned in the United States Army in 1976 after 1 year at the Virginia Military Institute and 4 years at West Point. In 1991, Dr. Macgregor was awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor for his leadership under fire of combat troops in the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, the lead element of 7th Corps during Desert Storm. This action later became known as the Battle of 73 Easting, the U.S. Army's largest tank battle since World War II. In November 1997, Dr. Macgregor was assigned to Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, SHAPE, as the J5 Director of Strategic Planning for the Balkans. In October 1998, he became the Director of the Joint Operations Center at SHAPE, a position from which he supervised the conduct and planning of operations during the Kosovo Air Campaign. Books written by Dr. Macgregor include Warrior's Rage, The Great Tank Battle of 73 Easting, Breaking the Phalanx, and Transformation Under Fire. He holds a master's degree and PhD from University of Virginia and is now an independent businessman. Please join me in extending a warm War College welcome to Dr. Douglas Macgregor.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thank you for coming this morning. I know that you had many other things that you could have been doing. There's always the Harry Potter movie, if you're desperate. It is nice to be in Carlisle. Both of my parents graduated from Dickinson, so it's kind of a trip down memory lane for me whenever I come here, having spent time here as a child. I also want to thank Major General Martin for having given me such a wonderful topic, Challenges to Strategic Leadership. That topic is so broad that if it were a tunnel, you could drive 10 M1A1 tanks through it abreast. And that confers a great deal of latitude on me today, and I'm going to exploit it to the maximum extent possible. I'm probably going to cover some things that you didn't anticipate, and I don't want to dwell too much on the past because I think we are in a fundamentally new environment now. And I mean that from an institutional standpoint in the United States Armed Forces, but particularly in the United States Army. And that's really what I'm going to focus on. So I think you'll find it thought-provoking, at least I hope you will. And again, thank you for inviting me to be here today. Next slide. Now, I know what many of you are thinking. You're looking at this and you're saying, oh my God, another sports analogy. Well, you know, not all sports analogies are wrong. It's been my experience. I grew up in North Philadelphia on the edge of Germantown in the 1960s, early 70s. We now call those areas the inner urban whatever it is. And it was a very exciting time frame for me. But I can tell you that the game that we played was basketball. And it was very interesting to me because I subsequently discovered that as you moved away from the urban center and away from the places where I was growing up, where we would play basketball, that the ball people played with got a little smaller because as you moved towards the suburbs, you ended up in these neighborhoods where there were lots of people building things in factories on assembly lines, and they tended to bowl, but it was still a substantial ball. As you moved further away from the city and into the real suburbs, everybody seemed to play tennis. This was sort of the upper middle class game. And finally, when you moved into the wealthy neighborhoods, you discovered that people were playing golf. And it's always been very interesting to me that within the structure of American society, the higher you go, the smaller the balls in play tend to be. And having done a lot of work over the years on Pennsylvania Avenue and on Capitol Hill, I can tell you that most of those boys are shooting with marbles. So, what's the real point of this slide? The point of this slide is that more often than not, we get things wrong. And when I say we, I'm talking about the senior officers, the 4 stars, whether they're generals, admirals, doesn't make any difference. There is a predisposition to see in the future what they really want to see, which is usually a reflection of the past. How anyone could have missed the dramatic increase in lethality in warfare over the last 150, 160 years is beyond me, but we did. I mean, just stop and think that at the end of the day at Waterloo, there were roughly 40,000 dead lying on the battlefield. That was just an incredible level of lethality created by artillery and firearms that by today's standards are really very primitive, but nonetheless were able to inflict that kind of damage. We see this lethality increase through the 19th century. By the time you get to Königgrätz in 1866, the great collision between the Prussian and Austrian armies, the casualties are even greater, and you're now talking about breech-loading rifles, breech-loading artillery, steel guns. It's a disaster in human terms. The carnage is beyond belief. As we move towards World War I, we get to the Russo-Japanese War, and the casualties the Japanese take at Port Arthur against the Russians are phenomenal. Thousands upon thousands of people being mowed down by machine guns, artillery, now grenades. You're now into a blast-centric battlefield. It's not just standard artillery, but mines and so forth. So the lethality continues to increase, but the nature and the structure of the organizations fighting really doesn't change very much. And the solution in the minds of most commanders is to actually increase the density of human beings on the battlefield, to somehow or another compensate in a human sense for this dramatic increase in firepower. So the point is, how you choose to look at things really shapes where things are really going to go, as opposed to where they probably ought to go. Had we looked carefully at what happened between 1815 and 1914, we probably would have reached different conclusions. So what I want to do is to try and get people to surf the wave a little bit better. In other words, look at where the true technology and destructiveness of warfare is headed and appreciate what that means for the United States Army. Next slide. Many of you will know this man, George Kennan. And George Kennan is probably one of the first people to articulate very effectively the enormous problem in American national military strategy. That problem is largely, but not exclusively, but largely the absence of any coherent framework that links the use of military power to realistic, attainable political goals. In fact, Kennan's observation was, we tend to do things overseas, beyond the borders of the United States, this is after the Second World War in Korea, not so much because we have to, because we need to, but because we're doing things that make us feel better about ourselves. We, after all, are the exceptional nation. We are the pristine example of the pinnacle of Western civilization. We live in a state of perfection. Just ask the Marine Corps. Yeah. So the point is, Kennan was saying, look, this is not necessarily strategy. Most of what we do is not shaped by the need to do something, but by the capability to act. Recall Madeleine Albright in the early 1990s, who confronted, at the time, General Colin Powell and said, listen, you keep talking about this wonderful army. What are you doing with it? And he was, of course, stymied by this statement, but her point was, American values are universal. Everyone can share our values and benefit from our values. And we need to export these values, and we want to use the United States military establishment to do it. And remember, in the aftermath of Desert Storm, there was this illusion of invulnerability, invincibility, of the United States enjoying a monopoly of power like no power had enjoyed, certainly since the Roman Empire. So the assumption was, we now have both the capability and this God-given right, if you will, to use the capability to export America to places that desperately need it. Now, places that desperately need it turn out to be opportunities that present themselves, places where we think we can tinker and get away with it, usually against adversaries who are very, very weak and not very strong. Sometimes we miscalculate. We certainly miscalculated in Vietnam. But the point is, that's not strategy. that is not tied to a national security strategy that drives a military strategy. So in the absence of any coherent strategic framework that defines national interests in tangible, concrete terms, and then ties a force design to those interests, what do the armed forces do? They essentially do whatever the generals and the admirals think is appropriate. And in bureaucratic terms, for the last 50, 60 years, that has largely meant defaulting to a force structure, a force design, and an approach to war with its roots in the Second World War. Now, that's not entirely unreasonable, because stop and consider for a moment that the last major event of a military nature that actually changed anything in the international system fundamentally was the Second World War. None of the interventions that we've involved ourselves in or have involved others since 1945 have fundamentally altered that system. Some would say that World War II ultimately continues until 1989 and then ends with the collapse of the Soviet occupation of Central East Europe. And that's unbelievably accurate, frankly. But the point is, that too is tied to the Second World War. So the profound tectonic shifts in the international system really go back to the Second World War. Nothing has fundamentally changed in profound terms since then. But we have, nonetheless, expended enormous blood and treasure all over the world with the object of changing things. And that was Kennan's observation. He simply said, it's wrong-headed, it's wasteful, and it should stop. But no one seems, at least until this point, to have come up with an answer as to how to stop it. But I think we're getting close. Next slide. And the answer is, we don't have any more money. We can't continue. We've put ourselves in phenomenal debt. And so, like any great power, like the British Empire, like Rome, like many of our predecessors, we are going to simply walk away from large numbers of places where we have been for a very long time because we can't afford to stay. We're just going to pick up and leave. Now, this doesn't mean we exit the stage. And in the case of the United States, that doesn't change our interests. Remember that we are of necessity, as an American people, first and foremost, a global aerospace power. We are of necessity a global maritime power. We are not a global land power, nor do we need to be. Because like the British Empire that spawned us, we are effectively an island nation. We are protected by the Atlantic, we are protected by the Pacific. We keep a watchful eye on those Canadians, of course. And to our south, in the Caribbean basis, we have a disaster, which I'll talk about later on, which does present a threat of types and kinds. But the point is, we have not had to deal with force on the continent that threatens our existence. We are not Germany sitting in the middle of the continent that has to deal with the very real prospect, or has had to deal for many, many centuries, with the prospect of invasion from various forces from the east, the west, the south. We are not Russia. We do not have this massive border in 1/6 of the world's land mass that is open to potential invasion from large numbers of people who are, quite frankly, unfriendly to Russians and dangerous. And the same thing, by the way, holds true for China. We're very different. We are an English-speaking people. And for that reason, we tend to see the world through a different lens. And for that reason, we have never maintained, for long periods of time, large standing armies. So now we have what is really an existential crisis for the Republic in financial terms. And that existential crisis is not limited in a political sense to the people in Washington that brought this on. This existential crisis now confronts the United States Armed Forces, and more particularly, the United States Army. So we're going to have to answer some tough questions about the future. The key thing to